Hi, I'm Ben Lieberman, professor of history at Fitchburg State University.
I'm Liz Gordon. I teach in Earth and Geographic Sciences at Fitchburg State.
And we're here to talk briefly about our book, Climate Change in Human History, and we're very grateful for the work of the team that made it possible to publish this in Spanish.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the history of how the book came to be. This developed out of a project when Ben first proposed that we teach a course in the subject of climate change in human history. And after teaching the course a couple of times and not finding quite the right fit as a textbook, Ben proposed writing a book. And so that's how this book came to be.
And it was really pretty fun, learning a lot more about both climate change and history to put it together.
So this is a list of topics that we cover in the book. These are the chapters, the names of the chapters. And so we're going to take you through a variety of these and give you a sense of some of the topics that are covered in each of these chapters. So this is a graph that shows climate change over 65 million years, just a kind of qualitative measure of when we had warmer versus cooler temperatures on the planet. So this starts out 65 million years ago and goes up towards the present day, towards the right. And we frame the book in the context of different timeframes of climate change. So what we'll take you through is the different timeframes and the different factors that affect climate change in these different timelines, and then the societal events that are going on at the same time. So we start off talking about climate change over tens of millions of years. We don't go into tons of detail about that because the primary factors that are controlling climate change on this timescale have to do with the shifting of plates, different plate tectonics, mountain building events. We don't go into lots of detail because this predates most of the history that we're focused on in the book, but we do touch on this.
And we start looking at different timescales and somewhat shorter timescales as we approach the history of humans. We talk briefly about the effect of climate change on human ancestors. There was an overall cooling trend along with other shifts, but generally an overall cooling shift, the shift to drier, more arid conditions in places such as rainforests of Africa in which human ancestors lived. And this made it more difficult for human ancestors living on the edge of rainforests to obtain their preferred diet, which is made up mainly of fruit. And so this created evolutionary pressure for some shift in diet. So climate change did create evolutionary pressure for human ancestors on a scale of some millions of years. And then amidst various fluctuations, this overall cooling trend continued with an expansion of grassland in Africa. And this continued to create evolutionary pressure and helped to lead to selection for human ancestors who had larger brains and had more reason to move to capture game, were better at walking, better at running, and also ate more meat. So we continue to see that pressure of climate change on evolution of early humans over a scale of a few million years.
And then we transition into slightly shorter timescales. So we discussed the climate change that occurs over hundreds of thousands of years. This time frame focuses primarily on Milankovitch cycles, which are indicated by these three cycles down in the bottom left. So this essentially focuses on the relationship between the sun and the Earth. So we look at how these Milankovitch cycles affect climate. This is indicated by this graph up here in the upper left. This particular graph goes from about 450,000 years ago towards the present day, looking both at carbon dioxide concentrations and the connection with temperature. And so these are the primary factors that we focus on in this time frame as far as climate change.
We focus on dispersion of human ancestors to different parts of the world, and there are some different explanations of how climate change affected those dispersions through both push and pull factors out of Africa. And this map is showing you routes of dispersion of Homo sapiens out of Africa to other regions such as Asia, Southeast Asia, and Europe. And so the time scale here is now on tens of thousands of years. And that becomes another really major factor as we get closer to history of humans, or that is modern humans. At this point, we're looking at anatomically modern humans, people very similar to us, but living in much, much, much smaller populations. So with this cycle of glaciation, the expansion and retreat of ice sheets had some pretty big effects on human living conditions, and at times led humans as well as other species to move away from ice sheets into areas that we can call refuges or refugia, and population drops at times created bottlenecks. Humans, though, proved extremely adaptable to cold weather. In some cases, lived pretty close to the ice sheets and used fuel and clothing to adapt themselves to cold conditions. So human ancestors, on a scale of some tens of thousands of years, lived with a much greater range of climate conditions than modern humans, but again, with much, much, much smaller populations.
Yeah, and so when we come out of that last glacial period that Ben was just discussing, we focus then next on how climate change occurs over thousands of years. So this is primarily focused on the Holocene, which is the past 10,000 years of our history. And so we start to examine some of the factors that affect climate change on this timescale. And so one of the big factors that we focus our attention on, particularly causing major events such as the Younger Dryas, which occurred about 12,000 years ago, are changes in ocean circulation. And so the bottom left panel that you're seeing is showing a simulation or visualization of deep ocean circulation. And so we talk a bit about how that's connected with climate.
After the last glacial maximum, as we move into the Holocene, this period of a comparatively stable climate with comparatively warm conditions, sufficient precipitation, this creates favorable conditions for domesticating plants and animals. And there were, in fact, multiple centers for domesticating plants and animals in the Holocene. The center in the Middle East or Near East is very well known, but there were others in China, the Americas, Southeast Asia, Africa, and you can see these multiple centers on this map. So it's quite telling for us in retrospect that human population also eventually grew with agriculture, and so overall populations increased far above the levels that we saw before the Holocene. And this also led to increasing hierarchy, we think, to greater social differentiation. This shows you people working in ancient Egypt, and we see people working in fields. So with a greater surplus of agricultural products, there's also the potential for greater collection of a surplus by elites. And so we think that there may have been a greater distance between elites and everyone else in those big agricultural societies of the Holocene. Even compared to previous periods, fairly modest fluctuations in climate could have profound effects on societies of the Holocene. So basically, if you can think of any human civilization, whatever it is, they're really all Holocene civilizations. They all emerged after the last glacial maximum in this period that turned out to be quite favorable for the emergence of larger populations, for collecting a surplus, for greater agricultural production. And so all the civilizations we can think of thrived in this area. That said, there were fluctuations in the Holocene, and we see that certainly human civilizations sometimes adapted to them, but in some conditions, these could cause particular shocks. And we see that with the case of the Indus River civilization. And this is showing you a satellite photograph of the remains of one of the cities, Mohenjo-Daro, of the Indus River civilization from about 4,000 years ago, roughly.
Yeah, so there was a study that was published by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute that focuses in on the climate change that influenced the Indus River civilization. This is somewhat of as a busy graphic, but I refer you to the study itself. But this did show evidence for the changing in drought conditions or precipitation conditions that led to the collapse of the civilization. So this top graph is showing how salty the Bay of Bengal is, and indicating that different fluctuations in salinity represents changes in precipitation. And so the lower the precipitation, the higher salinity, and that helps us to understand variations in precipitation. The second one shows changes in the types of vegetation that were existing across this pattern. I should point out, this starts 5,000 years ago up until present day. And so these changes that are recorded in various aspects of primarily ocean sediments allows us to understand how precipitation patterns changed, how that causes change in vegetation, and the influence of those changes on the civilization and others like it. And so there is so one of the ideas is that, or there is evidence to suggest that the changes primarily came with the strength of the monsoon. And so in times where you have a stronger monsoon, such as 45,000 years ago in this region, then that would lead to higher levels of precipitation and supporting agriculture, for example. Whereas a weaker monsoon developed around 3,000 to 3,500 years ago. And so that we see that in the evidence of more drought conditions. And again, that caused stress and collapse of civilizations during that time.
So under extreme conditions, climate change was a significant factor in even the collapse of the civilizations. Not the only factor, but a significant factor. That said, there's this growing trend over the Holocene to some societies with tremendous capacity to grow, to expand, to adapt. We see that in societies such as China and the Roman Empire, which you can see on this map, which also enjoyed great stability during a period which is sometimes called the Roman climate optimum. Optimum suggests the idea of good conditions for civilization. And so with, again, comparatively warm, comparatively stable climate during the Holocene, civilizations could really amass large surpluses from agriculture, and in the case of Rome, from trade as well.
So one of the climate factors that we focus in on during this time frame are the El Nino and La Nina events that occur and how they primarily affect precipitation across the globe. So these are a couple of maps that show how precipitation changes in conditions or years that are known as El Nino years versus La Nina years. And this is a factor that has caused influence in these regions. Some regions that experience drought conditions, for example, affected whether they're in El Nino or La Nina years. So this is one of the factors that starts to become really important on this timeline.
And so we see lots of examples in which climate change affects human history in this time period with comparatively stable conditions. For example, it's easier to travel across oceans. This is not the only, but again, one factor in Norse expansion or seafaring around 1,000 years ago, which led all the way to what's now the Canadian province of Newfoundland and to a short-lived Norse or Viking settlement called Lance au Meadow. And so these seafarers, again, benefited from that comparatively stable period of climate. At the same time, we also see that shifts in precipitation and in particular drought could pose really significant challenges to complex societies of the Holocene. And we see some really striking examples of that in the Americas. This shows you a civilization in what's now mainly northwestern New Mexico in the United States. And we're looking at an aerial photo of remarkable dwellings in a place called Chaco Canyon. And this was a major civilization, again, about 1,000 years ago, that suffered striking setbacks, again, to a large extent caused by prolonged drought.
So this gets us into climate change over hundreds of years, primarily looking at the last 2,000 years, for example. So this graph is showing us some of the temperature variation. And as we've been mentioning, the timescales, as we get to closer timescales, the temperatures have been fairly stable, but we do see variations that have influenced society. And so the two big big events that we focus in on during this time frame is a time period that's sometimes referred to as the medieval warm period or medieval climate anomaly that occurred about 1,000 years ago. And then temperature areas where temperatures got quite a bit cooler are referred to as the Little Ice Age. So we focus on these two time periods, examine some of the factors that were involved in causing climate to change in these two periods, and then focus on the impacts of those changes.
This is a graph which is showing how the Little Ice Age posed significant disruption to some complex societies. There's an interesting kind of paradox in that some complex societies of this period began to decouple a little bit from climate in that they proved to have greater and greater capacity to adapt to climate fluctuations, but at the same time, climate fluctuations did contribute to striking setbacks, for example, to the Ming Dynasty in China, which you can see collapsed just at the peak of the Little Ice Age in China. At the same time, and this is an example of that decoupling, this is an image which shows ice skaters in the Low Countries, the Netherlands, a little bit earlier, but roughly at the same time period, in this case in the 16th century. The mere fact that we see these ice skaters is striking. These paintings were produced for a market that may have liked those kinds of images, but it's also the case that you really are unlikely to be able to skate much on natural ice in these same countries today. The Little Ice Age did not drive the Netherlands into extreme poverty. In fact, the area generally flourished. So that's that what we're seeing here is growing robustness by complex societies over the last several hundred years. And this is another image from that same time period, kind of a testifying to the ability of the Netherlands, the Low Countries, to amass quite a lot of wealth, partly from trade in the early modern era. So the Little Ice Age did not make it impossible at all for these areas to grow economically at this time period. With the modern era, we begin to see kind of a reversal in that previously we've talked about fluctuations in climate then posing some effects on human civilization. But with the modern era, there's a reversal, and that's human civilizations that really more and more begin to affect climate. This may have happened on a smaller scale earlier. There's some debate about that, but it happens much, much more decisively with the Industrial Revolution. We're looking here at a reconstruction of a steam engine. The steam engines were developed partly to pump water out of flooded mines. There were different ways to power them, but eventually the steam engines are powered in particular by fossil fuels and coal. And by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, initially in Britain, the Industrial Revolution started to take off, which had major effects for the future of climate. The Industrial Revolution also begins to go global. It's not restricted to Britain. It moves to other parts of the world, to North America, eventually to places such as East Asia. And here we're looking at an image of Japan in the late 19th century with streetlights. Japan would begin to industrialize as well.
So we start to examine then the effect of industrialization on climate. Again, transitioning from this, looking at the time periods for which climate caused different effects in society, transitioning then to how humans are influencing climate. And so we're looking here at the change in the carbon dioxide concentrations since we began to keep records in 1958. So that's the top left, and how that plays out then in our temperature record, which you see in the bottom right of this graph. And so we start to examine the primarily anthropogenic impacts on climate.
And this has major effects on the natural world in so many ways. Here we're looking at glaciers almost vanishing from areas in Olympic National Park in the northwestern United States, and this has happened in so many other places over decades. Climate change is leading to pronounced obvious effects really everywhere at this point. This is showing us some pumps being placed in Miami Beach in Florida to try to stop flooding. Flooding along coasts varies a little bit depending upon local conditions, but it's a growing presence, really all over the world. This is just showing you Lagos in Nigeria, in West Africa, a very low-lying city. Many large cities are built close to the coasts and are therefore extremely prone to flooding from rising oceans. Bigger storms, bigger tides are going to have more effects with higher sea levels. Fire risk has also increased. This is showing you a terrible wildfire in Canada in 2016. We've seen, sadly, major wildfires in the Mediterranean, in Europe, in Australia, in the Western United States, and many, many regions over the last several years. We're also increasingly able, scientists are anyway, to estimate the degree to which climate change is making extreme events more likely, and this is called attribution analysis, and we're finding more and more connections between climate change and greater probability of extreme weather events.
So then we take some time to look at future projections, primarily focusing on the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. So this is a graph that shows projected carbon dioxide concentrations out into the future, depending on different pathways that are chosen. These are these representative carbon pathways, or RCPs, that the IPCC runs to try to project changes into the future. So we have various scenarios, and we see what the effects may be on carbon dioxide, and then that can be translated then into temperature changes that may occur. And so what we see is that in every scenario that is run, temperatures are projected to increase to at least more than 2 degrees Celsius. But in our worst case scenarios, it increases quite a bit higher. And so this is so we try to examine what are these projections, what are our best understanding of what projections are going to be, and then discuss some of the potential impacts on what those changes might bring about. One of the things that we try to focus on in the book and also in the class when we teach is that it isn't just about what's happening globally, but that sometimes the regional variations matter more to human society. And so we also look a bit about how, for example, this is showing two of the kind of the best case versus worst case scenarios that are run by the IPCC, and what the translation is into on the top panel, what the temperatures are projected to be versus precipitation changes, which often have a very large impact on society. And so we look at those projections and, again, try to determine impacts going out to the end of the century. And so that's just an overview of what our book discusses, and we appreciate the time to be able to talk about it.
Thank you.